Jackie. Thank you for joining me. I'm very, very excited. I feel like I feel like I know you already because I've discovered you. I think I was trying to remember how I found you. I think a client recommended one of your Medium pieces, and then I subscribed and have been reading your pieces for a while now and just feel very, very seen by your writing and really appreciate what you're putting out there into the world. And yeah, I have a lot of questions for you, but let's start out with your adult diagnosis. I actually don't know. Were you diagnosed at the same time, ADHD and autism, or was it a one-two punch, or
Yes.
was one first? Okay. So what exactly was going on in your life in the moment that really you started to look into it and put two and two together and seek out the diagnosis?
Mhm. Well, prior to my diagnosis, I self-identified as autistic. And I really only went for a diagnosis because I was considering returning to do a PhD and wanted some accommodations and things like that. And it was when I got my diagnosis for autism that they also mentioned ADHD. And so that was really the one I didn't see coming. I was like, oh, okay.
And what was it that made you self-diagnose? What was it about yourself that you started thinking and identifying as autistic?
Um, Originally, it was an art therapist I was working with who suggested I might be autistic. And I'm a therapist myself. And so, what we're taught in grad school about autism is very limited. And so, I was like, there's no way. There's no way I'm autistic. Thank you, no. And, she still encouraged me to do some reading. So I did. And then once I got to read things written by women and that it was more about the internal experience, then I really started to identify with it and was like, oh, and kind of went down the deep rabbit hole that most late identified autistics do of like, what does this mean? And through that was completely confident I was autistic and was comfortable continuing as self-identified. In fact, I kind of saw it as a badge of pride in a way, kind of like I don't find the diagnosis system in the States valid for autism because it's so flawed. And so it was kind of my way of being like, I'm not going to use you, system. And then ended up deciding to pursue it again, as I mentioned, because I wanted some accommodations. But
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah, I wish I had that clarity because I feel like I was diagnosed with ADHD, and it's only through interviewing and talking to women and just doing my own research and really like thinking about what are we talking about here, especially because when we would start talking about sensory issues. And I remember I had this video series on Instagram where I would talk about like only wanting certain spoons and only having certain mugs and overhead lighting and like anything that involves sensory. I would always get that response, which is, you're not talking about ADHD, you're talking about autism. And I would be like, okay, wait,
Mm.
what is this overlap? Some people say there's a huge overlap, and then I'm like, is there an overlap, or are we actually talking about autism? And so like I went down this rabbit hole journey of like, do I self-identify, and have read so many books, and I don't know, I feel like there's still so much like imposter syndrome that I'm experiencing a lot, right? And
Mm.
so part of me feels like I would really benefit from the official diagnosis, but also I'm like, I think my ADHD is just getting in the way of actually following through on it. And but you're right, and it's the same with my daughter too. Like my 17-year-old, like I pretty much have identified her as autistic as well, and we have a lot of conversations about like our experience. And she actually doesn't care. She's sort of like, maybe I am, maybe I'm not. Like for
Mm.
her, she's like she embraces the neurodivergent umbrella and identity, and she really doesn't. It doesn't bother her as much as it bothers me, where I'm like, I need to know yes or no. Um, and yeah, so I feel like very befuddled. And also not only that, but like I don't know if it was in if it was in Devin Price's book or if it was like a random tweet I saw once, but there was something of, that really a kernel that stayed with me, which was like, if you are doing a lot of research, people who aren't autistic don't tend to do a lot of research about whether they are autistic. And that's always stayed with me, but I'm also sort of like, well, but I don't know. Like, or like
Yeah.
you just said, you knew, right? And I'm like, how did you know?
I mean, to be fair, I didn't know right away. That was after months of deep diving. And I also write a lot, and my writing helps me process and think deeply on the information I'm consuming. So there was that as well.
Yeah. I know, right? It really
Yeah.
depends on what day you catch me, whether I'm like really, where I am on my scale of absolutely positive. And yeah, there's
Mhm.
no, I don't know, what are we even talking about here? And then I get it, go on this existential spiral. Um, but yeah, I'm curious with you looking back at your own experience as a therapist, one of the things that you write about a lot is sort of how therapists are not how neurotypical or holistic therapists just are getting it wrong when it comes to therapy with having autistic clients, and you as an autistic client would really like to find you, right? That piece where you were like, I wish I could find me, but obviously that's unethical. But like, I'm curious looking back at this journey and your late diagnosis and looking at therapy just as a whole.
Mhm.
What do you feel like? I, you know, Let me just backtrack a little bit. I'm getting off topic here already, and I haven't even asked you the question. So basically, I'm thinking like, I feel like I talk a lot with clients about how therapy, there's a lot of like baggage or resistance to therapy from neurodivergence women, especially because a lot of us have been
Mhm.
misdiagnosed with depression or
Mhm.
anxiety, and so um, we talk a lot about why therapy feels like it's not helpful, but I feel like it's much harder to
Mhm.
articulate what it is that wasn't helpful, right? And so I'm curious if you
Mhm.
have been able to articulate for yourself, like where therapists tend to go wrong when it comes to adult, not only autistic adults, but also like late diagnosed autistic adults, because I feel like
Mhm.
that's a very specific category.
Yes, there's a couple answers kind of nestled in there. Because like the thing about like going wrong, first of all, I don't think most therapists are equipped to identify that a client is neurodiverse. So that's obviously an issue from the start. But if we put that aside and say, okay, they are able to know someone is neurodiverse, there's still then, okay, what do you do with that and where do you go? And so in either case, someone who either isn't educated on, doesn't really either doesn't have the education or the lived experience or both. I think what they're doing is using, the best skills they have as a therapist. And unfortunately, those skills are designed for the general population. And sorry, this is like my long winded explanation. What I'm trying to get at is that a lot of therapy today is based on, okay, let's look at your thoughts, let's examine your life, like your trauma, let's like dive into all of that. And that is good and has its place. But for an autistic, what we really need to do is see like uh, the structure of their life, like their life. And what I mean by that is the impact of how full a person's day is going to have far more ramifications for an autistic than anyone else. Um, I feel like I'm not being clear. Let me pause for a second. Sorry, I was trying to like say many things at
I
once.
know,
And
right?
this is a lovely
This is
autistic thing that happens where
well,
my
I
brain
was
is
gonna
like,
say this is a huge
what?
ask too, because I'm like, I don't have the answer to this, right? Like, I feel like it's a
Yeah.
really, really difficult thing to articulate, and so it's like maybe
Well,
might be able to.
Well, and I don't want to invalidate that many autistics have trauma and trauma therapy has its place, and so does, examining our beliefs. But really, I see autism as an activated nervous system, and that you're constantly on alert, and you're constantly taking in more information, you're constantly having more thoughts. And so we need to work within that reality, and that means one, that a lot of the other tools aren't going to work. Like, hey, stop and examine each belief, see if it's true. Like, no, like that is just not possible with the sheer volume of thoughts going through most autistics' minds. And furthermore, we really have to look at how autistics can um, honor their energy cycles, essentially. That no matter what I do in therapy, I'm still going to get tired from socializing. I'm still going to get tired from the stinking leaf blowers outside. It's summer right now. They're driving me nuts. But that, like, there's this idea in therapy of like fixing yourself and like fix your mind. And a neurodivergent perspective is okay, you're not actually fixing what's going on in your head. Instead, you're trying to shift things in your environment and in your daily life and in your structure to honor how you naturally function. That's what I was trying to say.
Yes, no,
Without
it's
making any
beautifully said.
sense.
It is absolutely. And I think it's one of those things that I've had a really hard time articulating for myself, which is like, you're already usually like, this is really all I can come up with that's like, this is about mindset and reframing and self-concept and a
Mm,
lot of these vague terms that really, if you don't know what I'm talking about, have no frame of reference. So I think you articulated it very well, which is like, it doesn't matter how many tools I have in my toolbox. If I can't access them, now what? How do I stop feeling terrible about myself, right? And I think
yeah.
that's where it comes down to like really like so much more of it is psychoeducation and understanding your triggers and
Hmm.
understanding, I call them like notes in the margin about like who you are from one moment to the next.
Yes, and I think maybe a concrete example of all this is that I myself went to therapy starting in my 20s, being like, hey, like I something is not right,
Mhm.
you know? And I did all the trauma work. I did all these other like all the things, and I still didn't feel good. And so it felt like I was failing therapy.
Yeah.
Like I'm doing all the things. And so learning I was autistic really, one, freed me from trying to constantly change and fix myself, and then two, allowed me to see like, oh, it I'm I'm not too sensitive and need to like fix, whatever's being triggered in me. Instead, like, no, I'm a deeply connected, empathetic individual, and I need to honor that. And so, for instance, a concrete example would be I reduce the amount of news I consume or see, because like that really drags on my energy. And that's like what you were saying about notes in the margin. That's specific to me. Like, so it's been a process of learning like what um pulls at my energy, what kinds of things can I eliminate, as well as how can I structure in more recovery time, like naps and stuff like that, and then how can I reduce demands on me.
Right.
So
Which is, ironic given the mental health field, because the mental health field, like medicine and most clinical fields, are really terrible about allowing you to do any of those things, as I'm discovering.
yeah,
Um, so
yeah.
yeah, I have quite okay. So I'm also like getting my master's right now in clinical mental health counseling, and so I have a lot of questions.
Oh, really? Oh
Yeah.
my gosh. Woo. You must.
But I want to talk about
Okay.
art therapy too, because I feel like it
Hmm.
must have been really interesting to you to start out. You were diagnosed after you became an expressive arts therapist. And so now you'd be like,
Hmm.
oh, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like, I feel like arts therapy is so incredibly helpful and such a great tool for the neurodivergent brain. And I just wanted to
Hmm.
explore that a little bit and hear from you. And what were some of those realizations you made when you had, when you were diagnosed as neurodivergent or identified as neurodivergent? You know what I mean? What were some of those realizations you had about art therapy and just talk about, what are some of those benefits that are specific to working with autistic clients?
That's a lot of questions
I know,
nestled
right? I
together.
have a tendency to ask you five questions in
No,
one
I'm just like,
sentence.
yeah, and I have so I'm going to just start where it makes sense for my mind, which is first and foremost, it had me look at my own art process differently. Whereas many times I had difficulty articulating and conveying the strength of what I was feeling. And art helped me to do that I could point at the picture and be like, it feels like this. Because a lot of times as autistics, we feel so much at once. And so looking back on my life, it helped me to see why during difficult periods I turned to art so frequently. And then in terms of being an art therapist and how it helps neurodivergent clients, I think it's a very similar thing in that there's just some things that are hard to get out, as well as we need way more processing time than most people. And when I say, I should say like neurodivergent. So includes ADHD. We just need time for things to work their way through our brains, and art helps us with that, as well as gives us a place and an outlet for all the intense emotions and thoughts we have. So it's just so many levels. I mean, and there's also other levels, like with themes come up in someone's art that they may not be aware of that I notice as an art therapist. There's so many things happening. And that, like, I also like that it's a tool you can continue to use between sessions. So most of my clients I meet with once a month, and I give them tailored activities to work on each week we're not together. And so it's nice that they can really sit and have the time to explore the things we're talking about. And then we can get back together and look at their art and be like, oh, did you think about this? Or, oh, like, what about this? And um, yeah, I could go on a long time about art therapy. So I'll stop there. I'll pause for any questions.
No, I like that. And I really like how you tied it not only to just the expressiveness, right? Like just an alternate option for expression. And I think that can be so helpful because I think, one of the things that I've realized in just working with and interviewing so many women with ADHD and is that we all diagnosed in adulthood, like we all had this question, which was like, what's wrong with me? Right? Like we all moved through life
Mm-hmm.
saying, I'm different. What's wrong with me? And that frustration of being able, not being able to, um, our intentions are very different from our actions a lot of the time. And I think that really like the depression that is experienced, just like we have neurodivergent burnout, I feel like there is neurodivergent depression. And I feel like that kind of
Mm-hmm.
depression often comes from a frustration, which is like, why am I so wrong, right? Why am I disappointing other people? What is wrong with me? And how can I be that person that I'm supposed to be? Right?
I
Go
would
ahead.
tie into the role of hope, and that a lot of times we reach a point of hopelessness.
Mhm.
Like I don't know how to get to where I want kind of feeling. And I've been trying and trying and trying, like tied to what you're saying about the brokenness. And so hopelessness is directly tied to depression, suicidal ideation. Like it's a really big factor that I myself have experienced at different times. And I hear from my clients many times.
hmm Right. And so I feel like just being able to have something nonverbal, that you can feel, have a pure connection with, I'm guessing, is something that must be very, very important.
Yes, and
Yeah.
to be clear, expressive art therapy includes all art forms, which includes writing. And
Yeah.
so a lot of times I'm giving my clients writing assignments, or I'm saying, imagine what this painting would say to you on this subject. And so that's also helping to make those connections in our brain. And yeah, well, I won't get into it. It's just working on so many different levels, but um, helping us to externalize what's happening, and then also be able to like talk about it with those that we need to talk about it with. Meaning, for instance, if you're having difficulty with a partner or a friend, that you're then able to talk about those issues with them.
Mm-hmm. Um, Now, I'm also curious, you decided to interview, how many have you interviewed at this point? Is it 69 or somewhere? How many people have
Mm.
late diagnosed autistic adults have you interviewed at this point?
A lot. I think it might be over 100 because
Oh, wow.
I did autism interviews, and then I did combined autism and ADHD interviews, and then I did autism mini interviews.
Oh,
So
okay.
it's yeah,
Awesome. All
yeah.
right. Well, I'm curious because I know for me, I kind of like backed into this whole podcast where I was diagnosed and I really, really wanted to have conversations with people to understand myself better, or just like, to verbally process. And so I built this podcast platform so that I had a reason to reach out to people to interview them.
Mm.
Because I was
Oh,
like,
that's
nobody's going to
cool.
just want to talk to me without this platform. And but it was very, I've often said on this podcast where I'm like, it's purely selfish. And one of the things that always amazed me
Mm.
was I feel like over the years of interviewing people, like that's how I learn, right? And it's been really nice for me to
Mm.
think about this exchange, this one-on-one exchange, as being so being so symbiotic for the interviewee, who also gets to share their story and benefits from that. But then also there's the
Mm.
listener that benefits from hearing us talk about our shared lived experience. And it was just like, I didn't plan any of that. Like, I'd love to, take credit for actually having thought this out, but it was really just like this
Mm.
beautiful, accident. And so I was just curious for you, when you decided you were going to start interviewing late diagnosed adults, like what were you looking for, and what did you find, or what are you finding?
To be clear, my interviews are very different than yours. That in I send written questions to people, and
They're
then they
great
get to
questions, by the
write
way.
their answers on their own time. So
Yeah.
it's not live, it's not really a conversation, which quite frankly, I did it that way because I didn't have the capacity to have more conversations. As a therapist, it takes a lot of energy, like mental, emotional energy, to show up at the level that I do for people. And I just, I already limit the amount of clients I have to honor that. And so it was like, I don't have more energy for in person, for live conversations.
Mhm.
But I was still super curious. That's what drove me. I was like, I want to know, like, am I the only one here? Or like, I just wanted to hear more experiences from late identified autistics. And that's why I started it. Um, and same with like each iteration of the interview. Like when I did the combined autism and ADHD, it was the same thing where I was like, gosh, this is so confusing. Like, what is what? And how do others see this? And I'm sure, yeah, we were kind of talking about this at the beginning of our conversation, just how confusing it is to know what is autism, what is ADHD, and what does it look like when someone has both, and just those kinds of questions. I was really curious to know what other people thought of, especially since the scientific literature is not there yet. You weren't even allowed to be diagnosed with both until 2013. So that means you couldn't even have studies where you're diagnosed with both before that. So there's not a lot of concrete things you can turn to. And so I was like, well, let's go for lived experience.
Right. Well, and I think, speaking of confusing, because yeah, I feel like it, I feel like I'm constantly going in circles and coming back to this, like, what actually are we talking about? And it was interesting because for me, I feel like for me, autism is, like you said, autism is the brain and the nervous system. And ADHD is the behaviors that result from a dysregulated nervous system, right? Or they are kind
Hmm.
of the outward behaviors. And so that's, I almost think about it in terms of, the orchid and the dandelion. Have you heard of that? The two types of
Mm-mm.
children. You have an orchid that takes a lot of care and and then you have a
Oh,
dandelion
okay,
where
yeah,
you could
yeah.
basically just put them in any situation and they thrive. And for me, I'm sort of like, that's kind of how I think of autism versus ADHD, where I think of ADHD, and I don't know if this is correct. This is just what I've decided because
Hmm.
it's easier for me when I think about what is what and what's the overlap. And when people say there's such a huge overlap, and I'm like, is there, or are we actually talking about autism? Right. And so what I've landed on is this idea that like ADHD is what happens when you are in like environments that are chronically inhospitable to your type of thinking, your brain, and your nervous system. And so we
Hmm.
talk about ADHD as in terms of its deficits and in terms of the, disorder, and it's, much more pathologized. And yet, so, autism is sort of like the base, the home base, or,
Hmm.
and I have no idea if that's correct, but that's sort of how I've
Wait,
decided to
so
think about
in
it.
that framework, who's the dandelion?
Somebody who's holistic or neurotypical.
Oh, okay. I wasn't sure if like the ADHD person was a dandelion. I was like, what? What's happening?
Right. Well, well, that's so I have a hard time. So then, the question is, well, can you be ADHD and not be autistic? And then what does that look like? And does that come from trauma and not genetic neurobiology? And how, but then again, it comes to that question of like, well, how do you even judge trauma in terms of your whole lifespan, right?
Yeah.
Especially as a woman living in America. Like, there's just, how do you even begin? And, those questions. Anyway,
But
I'm,
actually, can I
yeah,
jump in here though?
of
Because I do
course.
have some opinions, and I want to be clear, they're just opinions. It's like you were
Yes.
saying for yourself, right? That um, I don't want to misrepresent something. It's like these are the facts. It's more like we're all just trying to figure this neurodivergent world out,
Yeah.
and the more theories and ideas, the better. And from the interviews to the amount of clients I've had to my personal experience, I see autism as a different neurotype, meaning the brain is literally firing in different ways and causing other pathways in the brain to fire at the same time. And this also causes an activated nervous system, which for me, when I'm exploring with someone if they're autistic, we're looking at six main categories. And this is going to tie into the ADHD thing. I'm going somewhere. But so we are looking at, their mental characteristics, their emotional characteristics, body, sensory interests, and then how they socialize. And all the ADHD, um, the typical symptoms listed in the diagnostic manual show up in the executive function area, so in the mental characteristics of autism. And so I think that all autistics exhibit ADHD quote quote symptoms to some degree. It's just if the intensity and frequency are strong enough to meet the diagnostic criteria. So
Yeah.
that's why also, the scientific literature is saying that 70% of autistics are also ADHD. I think that's why there's such a strong overlap. But as for your point about, just being solely ADHD, and I hadn't thought about it from your side, so I'm like what you were saying. So I'm
Right.
gonna think on that more.
Well, and to give it some context too, like one of the things that I've been endlessly confused about being in the mental health counseling program and having this, going through the curriculum right now and seeing how neurodivergence is just not talked about at all, or it's tacked on
Yeah.
at the very end, or it's talked about in these sort of extreme stereotypes of what an autistic person looks
Uh-huh.
like, or an ADHD child,
Mm-hmm.
or they talk about it in very like vague, situations where they lump it in with like
Yep.
criminals, where they're like, the criminals and deviants and people with ADHD. And you're like, wait a minute. But like, one of the things that I
Yeah.
find fascinating is the fact that I see autism and ADHD everywhere in all of the case studies, in all of the like, things that,
Mhm.
especially in talking about the DSM and talking about like, even just PTSD, right? And we'll say these comments very flippantly, where it's like in the military, some soldiers come back from the exact same experience, and some of them have PTSD, and some of them don't. So it's a neurobiology, as to, it's up to neurobiology if you have it or you don't, or maybe it's genetic. And I'm like, is that autism? Like, is that what we're talking about here? And so I'm always thinking like, when people say sometimes you do, sometimes you don't, and we're coming back to just who that person is, when we say who that person is, when they're more susceptible to trauma, is that a form of autism in itself, right? And so I'm always looking at like, I just feel like I'm seeing it everywhere. And then I get back into my state of self doubt where I'm like, am I? Or am I misjudging this and I'm totally confused and I have no idea what I'm
Yeah.
talking about, right? And I'm like,
Yeah. Well,
go ahead. So
yeah.
having been through the
I was gonna say
program and
that's
now thinking
oh,
about it in retrospect, I'm like always, it's like you said, these are all theories, and I find it very validating whenever I talk to any clinician, psychologist, psychiatrist, anybody on this podcast, and they also have really no have idea, right? Like I find it very validating because I'm like, okay, so there's not like some book that I need to still read. Like it's really there's so many question marks around this. But anyway.
though I will say for myself, in terms of being able to identify autism, it is very clear
Okay.
that um, like I mentioned those six categories and looking at what kind of characteristics are show, and that's my word instead of symptoms because I don't want to pathologize. Um, what kind of characteristics are showing up in each of those, and how long they've been like have they been present since childhood, and um, as well as it's a very common thing for autistics to fluctuate back and forth between hyper and hypo, meaning sometimes you might like the light might be too much and you're like, oh, I can't have any light, and that's a hypo state where you're like, oh, too much. And then other times you need light to feel alive and to feel happy in that moment, and that's a hyper state where you're craving something. And so that fluctuates anyways. The point being that like for me there are very specific things I look for, because one of the main reasons people meet with me is to know if they're autistic or not. And so um, it's something I've worked pretty hard on, but in terms of like uh, really understanding the breadth of characteristics and what we're looking for when trying to identify it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I get that. It's funny because I often my other joke with not getting diagnosed with autism is the fact that I'm like, what if they say no? Then what? Right? That's my big fear. And
Yes, that's
right?
so true. I hear that all the time. Like, I think that's
Like,
terrifying.
what
Yep.
will I do? And because we talk
Mm-hmm,
about the
mm-hmm.
diagnostic criteria is flawed, and it's also very
Yep.
old, and so there's this lived experience, there's the modern dialogue
Yep.
that's happening online, there's it's advancing so much faster than so many
Yeah.
clinicians who were educated 30 years ago or
Yep.
whatever. Like, so
Yeah.
really it's such a crapshoot in terms of who you get and who you're talking to and who's diagnosing you. And
Yep.
so I'm sort of like, the fear of being told I'm not is too great. And what do I do with that? Right? Where I'm like, I don't even know
Yeah.
what to do with
Mm-hmm.
that. And then, but I also, in terms of ADHD, I will often, I also admitted after starting this podcast that I was like, I started the podcast before I was even officially diagnosed with ADHD because I was so excited. And, I always jump first and think later. And so I started the whole thing. And then in the back of my mind, I was like, what am I going to do? What am I going to do if my doctor says I don't have it?
Oh,
And
yeah,
right. And then, of course,
yeah.
she was like,
Yeah.
I came in with all my forms and everything. And she was like, no, you had me at hello. So it wasn't a big deal in the end. So part of me is sort of like, when I talk to people about that doubt, right? That self doubt, that
Yeah.
lack of self-trust, that confusion, that lack of like really feeling in touch with your intuitive self, like that's all part of ADHD. So if you're having all of that imposter syndrome and that confusion, like
Mm.
that's a pretty good sign that you're on the right track. And so part of me feels like I should be telling myself the same thing when it comes to autism, where I'm like, if I'm so afraid that somebody's going to say
Yeah.
no, that I'm avoiding trying to even go after the diagnosis, that's pretty much the means I'm on the right track. So I'm curious. You just said that a lot of your clients
Yeah.
will say stuff like that. What's how do you talk them
Yeah.
through
Well, I
that?
also want to jump in on like another thing here in that the criteria in the DSM-5 for autism is all based on external behaviors. So they're looking at like, what are you exhibiting? And when I meet with people, I'm not looking at that. I'm looking at, are you having the interior experience of autism, regardless of how it manifests externally? And so it's not that I see the DSM-5 as incorrect. Like, it's just not sufficient. It's not all there is. It's not going a level deeper. And that's why so many people get missed because, oh, are you exhibiting that like rigidity and that like rigidity is actually just a way of having routine so that we have to make less choices and things can be more clear because there's so much going on in our minds and we're taking in so much. So like once we start to see that, we can see autism a little differently, that like rigidity is not what defines autism. The rigidity is actually a coping mechanism of what's happening in an autistic person's mind.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that's a long caveat to what you were saying about self-doubt, but I think one of my goals when I work with clients is that I want them to fully understand their autistic mind. I don't want my goal isn't like, yes, no, you're autistic, goodbye. Like, I want them to know, like, okay, and what does this mean for me? How does that, because autism and ADHD are going to show up for each of us differently, as well as we're going to cope with it all differently. And so I want anyone who concludes with me to have that information and to understand themselves on that level so that they can then sculpt their lives in a way that like honors that, which will automatically decrease what we were talking about with the depression or the anxiety or the other co-occurring things we often get either misdiagnosed or diagnosed with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I think that's really well said. Thank you. I wanted to shift a little bit because you've written quite, how many books have you written? You've written quite a few, right?
Yeah, five.
Five. And I'll put a link to your website and all of your amazing books. But I was really struck by the picture books, especially around the picture books in around your mom and her journey through
Hmm.
chemotherapy, and then also your journey through grief. And so beautiful and so wonderful. And I, were you diagnosed before or after your mom passed away?
After.
After, right? Okay. So, one of the things, so was I. And so one of the things I sort of have really, the one person in the world I wish I could talk to
Hmm.
about my adult diagnosis is my mom, because I felt like she was also very confused, with me growing up. And
Yeah.
she saw how much I struggled and how deeply hurting I was a lot of the time with,
Hmm.
with those questions. And so I was curious if you had similar feelings of, do you look back at your family members and see neurodivergence? Do you see it in your mom? Is this a conversation you wish you could have had with her?
I'm sorry. I struggle when there's like questions and questions. Um,
I don't know how not to. I'm such a
I know it.
nosy.
I
I'm
don't
so
worry. I do
nosy.
the
I'm
same
like,
thing.
just pick one.
This is another interesting thing about neurodivergence, right? Like here I am struggling with multiple questions at once, and yet when I work with my clients, I also do the same thing. I end up asking multiple questions at once.
I
So
know, right?
it's,
Yeah.
anyways. Um, um, I think my lived experience with my family is so unique in that I grew up in a very religious home. I grew up at a Christian camp that my parents helped run, and that really shaped the expectations of who I should be as a human. And so I don't know that my mom would necessarily accept my neurodivergence.
Mhm.
I don't like she constantly was guiding me to like give your problems to God, pray for help, those kinds of things. And her number one goal for me was to have a relationship with Christ. So if autism in any way distracted from that, I don't know that she would uh, accept it.
Yeah.
So I don't want to get too off topic here, but yeah.
No, I think it's fascinating because I also was raised in a very fundamental evangelical household,
Mm.
and refer to myself as an ex-evangelical. And but one of
Oh,
the
there's the
things.
book too. Sorry, go ahead.
Wait, what? Oh, your
There's a
book?
book called no. There's a book
Oh.
called Ex-Evangelical. That's so good.
Oh,
Yeah.
really? Oh, I haven't read that. I mean, I've heard the term before,
Yeah.
obviously, but
Yeah.
yeah, it is very fascinating to me in terms of just some of the how dogma and neurodivergence intersect or don't. And,
Yeah.
my own sort of oppositional nature growing up and just how both of my parents sort of dealt with being very religious as well. And but one of the things I will always credit not only my mother but my grandmother were how curious and open-minded they were. And so one of the things that I was always, people would always, like my oldest brother is gay, and people were always like, how did your mother
Mm.
deal with that? Because she was very accepting and she was fine. She never wanted to be rejecting any of her children. She was very loving and accepting of all of us, even when one by one we all left the church. Boom, boom. Like we still had a relationship. And she was always very curious and always was sort of like, I don't understand why you think the way you do, but help me understand, right? And
Mm.
that for to me was so antithetical to what I learned about the church. I could never really understand how she could be both. And now looking back, I'm like, I feel like she probably was neurodivergent. She was the neurodivergent one. Maybe. I don't know. I could never
Mm.
decide if she was or wasn't because she was also like, of certain that boomer generation where she was very organized and had a lot of routines around like domesticity, which I don't. And, so there was part of me that always thought of her as being like very together. But now I look back
Mm.
and I'm like, no, that was probably how she survived being a woman
Mm.
in that era. But anyway, I don't even know if I had a question in there. Was there?
I don't think so. No.
No,
I
probably
was,
not. I just was so, when I was looking at your books and was just thinking about your this love and this ode to your mother, and and the experience of grief too. I think grief is another one that is so isolating, especially considering it's universal
Mm.
and all of us go through it. Every single one of us loses a loved one, and yet was one of that grief. The loss of my mother was one of the most isolating experiences of my life, and I found that really fascinating because I'm sort of like, is that a universal experience? Is that neurodivergent experience? I'm not sure, but I found it really, really um it was really hard to share, and feel
Yeah,
connected to literally anyone else in that universal experience. So I feel like you know what I'm
I
talking about.
agree. Well, yes, and I mean, the book was born from, to be clear, the book's called Grief is a Mess. And so it's about like how messy grief is. And it was born from the experience of watching all my family members and friends respond to my mom's death differently, as well as like their expectations of me and how I should be grieving. And it it just kind of felt like let me have space to just be whatever I am and feel however I'm feeling and think however I'm thinking. And that it's all over the place. It is all over the place. And that's what I captured in my book. It's like sometimes some days you're like happy and then other days you're like, oh my gosh, like it's just so, so, so sad. And I really just made the cartoons from that, of like honoring and looking back. That is one book that I'm like, wow, that is such an autistic thing to do. It turns up to be like, this doesn't make sense to me. Let me try to like break it up into categories and like make sense and like capture it all with art in these different ways. And so I have a kind of a lot of empathy for myself looking back, making that book. I'm like, oh, I see what you were doing there, Jackie.
Yeah. Oh gosh, right? It's funny because talking about the long processing experience, especially when it
Mm-hmm.
comes to
Yep.
emotion. That was something that I also really related when you were talking about like the impetus for the book and how grieving looks very different. And so going back to that question of what's wrong with me, I remember feeling like there was a lot of expectation to cry and I didn't right away
Mm. Yeah.
because
Mm-hmm.
I hadn't processed it. It wasn't real to me in any way. And so there was this
Yeah.
performative element at the funeral where I was sort of like felt like, why is everyone crying and I'm not? I'm the daughter of I'm supposed to. And feeling really
Mm-hmm.
like there was something wrong with me. This was all before my diagnosis. And so but I hadn't, and so again, like I talk about this a lot with my clients when it comes to happiness on the other side of that spectrum, which is like happiness looks very different for different people, right? And I think that's, what we were talking about with the
Mm-hmm.
book. Like there's no one way to experience happiness. Happiness doesn't necessarily mean you're smiling. It doesn't even mean that you are content or light. Sometimes happiness is a furrowed brow, right? I talk about Sisyphus a lot because I think about like sometimes happiness is like feeling really like you're solving a puzzle, right? It's that fulfillment that comes from
Oh
really
yeah.
digging in and I always would joke that like we're the ones at a party where everybody else is having small talk and dancing around. We're the ones like on the back of on a couch having a deep conversation about the time-space continuum because I'm like that brings me
Yeah.
joy. I also like to dance, but I'm like, for the most part, I'm like, let's cut the small talk and get right into the intensity of it. And so I'm like, that's happiness, right? So happiness is going to look very different for a lot of people. And you always joke like I don't like to open gifts in front of other people because my response always betrays,
Mm.
right? But
Yeah.
I think it's like I never look happy enough or I never look grateful enough, and so I'm so worried about how they will receive me, and then I get too worried
Mm-hmm.
about it, right? And so it's like, but I had never really thought about how that connected to that length of time it takes to really just process intense emotions and how similar it was in terms of the grieving process. So, yeah, interesting. Thank you.
Well, and what you're saying, like it's the same with like joyful things. Even like sometimes people will be like, why aren't you more happy when like something good, really good happens? And sometimes I'm like, it just, I don't know. A couple hours later, it'll hit me, and I'll be like, but
Right?
like it just, yeah, it takes its time.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so, oh man, I feel like I could just pick your brain for hours. So thank you for going on this like meandering journey with me. That's the other thing. I always feel like I send these questions ahead of time to people and never stick with them, and I feel terrible. Uh,
Well,
so,
can I tell you? I'll tell you a little secret. I didn't read them.
oh,
I
good.
saw you sent them, and I intentionally didn't read them because then I will become obsessive and try to prepare too much. And so it was like, no, no, don't look, Jackie, don't look.
Oh, I'm so
Because
glad
I
you
want to
said
be
that.
more spontaneous in the moment. I do still appreciate that you sent them for, your guests that prefer that. But for myself, I was like, don't do it. Don't look.
Oh, I love to hear that because for me, I feel guilty if somebody has prepared answers and then we don't get to them because I feel like it's such wasted
Mm.
effort. So, but I am curious, especially given how, ADHD is such a deficit-based name and it's so stigmatized. There's so much stigma around ADHD right now for myriad reasons. But the name is so problematic. Whereas I don't feel like there's that same conversation around autism. And so I'm curious if you could rename ADHD to something else. Would you call it something else?
No. I mean, not that it just would feel weird. It just feels weird to give it a name anyways.
Yeah.
In that, at least for myself, that it just, my brain functioning is just part of who I am. It's almost like when people are like, "Are you an artist?" And it that feels like separating it from my identity, where it's like, no, I do art. Like
Mm,
I am. And so
yeah.
the same with like my neurotype. But I'm with you on that. There's a lot of negative things said both about ADHD and all, but I really see it as enhancing my life. Like, yes, there's a lot of challenges, but it also helps me like see things differently and experience the world differently, and in a way that I'm really grateful for. I mean, granted, I do sometimes. I'm like, what is it like inside other people's brains? Like, I really do wish I could sit inside someone's brain who's allistic or neurotypical and just observe and be like, what is it like in here?
I know, right?
But
Uh,
yeah.
yeah. No, I'm the same. I'm the same. I have that reminded me of identity first and person first language around autism and ADHD, and I feel like in terms of identity first, like I don't know who I would be without it, right? So I can't even imagine not having it. And so it's everywhere in everything I do and think and say, it's
Hmm.
everywhere. And so I can't
Yep.
even comprehend of what part of me exists without it. And so I often don't understand how you could use person first language original sometimes. I mean, I get it and I get how helpful it can be for some people. And I don't feel like there's one or the other that is the better way. I just like conceptually have a really, really hard time thinking about it. And so that's how I end up, like you said, seeing the positive side of it because I have no choice, right? It's
Hmm.
like seeing the positive side of anything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For yourself, then, with ADHD, how do you choose to identify? Do you say like you're an ADHDer? Like
You
about,
know,
like the,
I don't really like, I feel like I probably default to person first language just because it's so awkward to say ADHDer, more like from a grammatical point of view than I do
yeah, yeah,
necessarily
I know.
from
That's
like
why
an
I feel lucky
identity.
to be like autistic is easy, but ADHD, it's like,
I know
oh,
it's more
how do you
awkward.
say that?
Um, so it's like I embrace identity first, but even though I haven't really come up with one way of saying it, one way or the other, but I think about it in terms of like just any and depression too. A depression one is another one where I sort of feel like am I no longer depressed now that I have ADHD is another question I have all the time, which is sort of like,
Mm,
no, I don't ask those questions like what's wrong with me anymore. And so I feel like I'm probably not depressed, but I also spent a very long time using identity first language around depression so that I could
mm,
find joy, right? So that I could be like, yes, I am a depressed person, but I also have moments of joy and I'm also a good mother and a good partner and all of those things. So, but I never thought of myself as getting rid of it, right? I just thought of myself as living with it.
yeah.
And so, but I
Wow.
do feel like people who say I was misdiagnosed and I could absolutely say without 100% that I don't have depression. And I was like, how? How are you able to say anything 100%? Like I'm sort of, I don't know if I'm just having a good run of it and
Oh.
it sort of comes and goes and ebbs and flows, sort of like ADHD. Sometimes I'm like, I'm on the
Hmm.
ball and I don't feel like I'm a hot mess, but it doesn't mean I don't have it anymore. I don't feel like you can be
Hmm.
cured of it. And so
Gosh,
that's where
we could talk a while on
I know,
this.
right? I know.
I'm sorry,
Um,
I won't, yeah, yeah, yeah.
but I see a lot of the merit for identity first language in a lot of diagnoses, or at least I like to contemplate it, in a lot of those parallels with various other quote unquote disorders. So,
Hmm.
anyway, thank you, Jack. This is so wonderful. So JackieSchuld.com. I'll have a link in the show notes to your website and also to your wonderful Medium blog, I guess. Is there another name for that? Or is just account?
Yeah, I think that's the right. I mean,
Yeah.
I call my
You're
writing essays,
yeah.
but they're just so
Um
many pontifications on.
They are really, really wonderful, and I'm so glad I found you and just really, really appreciate the depth of thought that you put into a lot of these questions. And I never trust people who have their mind made up about literally anything. So, so I really like the fact that you are so curious and open to so many things, and it expresses so well through your writing. So thank you for putting that out there. Is there
Thank
anything
you.
else that is there anywhere else where you want people to find you or look you up,
Oh.
or um, if somebody wanted to work with you?
I'm like, I'm like, ah.
I know, right?
My website is if someone wants to work with me, yeah, you can go to my website. I'm currently full, but if you check in once a month, I update if I have a spot open. But I'd say that the other thing is I do try to be more accessible through my writing. That's kind of my way of being like, hey, here's what's I do not have unlimited time, but like for instance with my book about autism, I was really trying to lay out like here's what I'm seeing. And um, so yes, that's the easier way to interact with me is through the writing.
Mm, yeah, awesome. Well, thank you again. It's been a real pleasure, and yeah, hopefully, um, well, our paths will cross again someday.
Yes. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Jackie.